Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come in the 32nd chapter in the book of Exodus. We're going to make it only up to the 14th verse. There's enough dramatic material, we feel, to stretch out into a full-length video lesson. But before we do that, we just want to establish the narrative context in which it emerges. This takes us really all the way back to the 24th chapter, in the 18th and final verse of which we read that Moses ascends for a special revelation, the process of which takes some 40 days. And then we have a description of this revelation that encompasses and spans the range of the 25th through the 31st chapters. We have this almost blissful interlude between Yahweh and Moses of these great plans and these beautiful artifices he has planned for his people and his community. But then we don't really think of the community itself and what are they doing. That's when we read in the 32nd chapter. This is one of Israel's outstanding failures in the wilderness period. And the script, one of the reasons I think the Bible is true is because it is open, honest, and accurate with the failings of many of its human protagonists. They are there, warts and all. This is a wart. Particularly the blemish belongs on Aaron, who I think, as we'll read, and I'll explain why as I do, showed absolutely no spine or backbone in catering to the demands of the mob. And we'll touch on that as we go. We're just going to open with the opening verse, which reads, "And when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, 'Arise, make us mighty ones who go before us. For this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him.'" So we're going to break it down from the top. That's kind of a mouthful. So impatience was what was motivating this restlessness, and then they were a people of promise. He had promised them through his prophet Moses that he would be their deliverance and lead them to the promised land. But because they doubted, that posed all sorts of complications in their realization of the promise. And Aaron was his brother. He was 3 years older than him, and he was born a slave, and he never really escaped the slave mentality, because that's what we see Israel succumbing to. They're preferring the security of bondage over the challenges of liberty, because they are impatient. They want it now. They're wondering what's taking so long with this man Moses, who they never really fully trusted, because he was raised in Egyptian royalty. He knew not the life of the Hebrew slave, and even on the day when he violently intervened in defense of one, the Jewish community didn't take long to use it against him, sending him as an exile, a man on the run for the next 40 years. Then he returns 40 years later to shepherd the people Israel from Pharaoh to the promised land. So the 40-year interlude in which he was a shepherd was key, and it was also essential that he was raised in Egyptian royalty, because he would have been familiar with the protocols on how to approach Pharaoh, something no ordinary subject could do, but having been born and raised with him. So remember, they're in a state of inertia, and they have impatience in response to the state of their activity. So they're sitting on the mountain twiddling their thumbs because they are bereft of leadership. Now Aaron is appointed to be the high priest, and as such he is entrusted and in charge to maintain the purity of the faith, of the laws that had been given to him by Moses to enforce. Yahweh had given him through Moses for him to enforce. And what they're doing right now is it had only been 12 chapters ago that they received the 10 Commandments, so they couldn't have been too long, since maybe 40, 50 days tops between. I don't really have a chronology between the 20th and the 24th chapter, but we're just gonna stick to the passage. And they didn't know what became of them, so their mystery is creating an itch that they want to scratch by succumbing to an idol, because they don't know who this man Moses is, or what he is, or what he has him doing out there. Why don't we just go make an idol to celebrate them as the deliverer of our nation? For all we know, Moses is dead or lost or has abandoned us. And Aaron said to them, take off the golden earrings, which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. Now, this is why I think I kind of maybe wasn't completely fair, but as far as the text indicates, Aaron showed no resistance to the catering of they had asked to make him an idol, and he showed no resistance whatsoever, at least none indicated in the text. I do want to be fair. I don't know if he had any initial resistance at all, but just to already be informed that he was to be the high priest. And many of these revelations that Moses was receiving right now would be his responsibility to enforce, and he would be entrusted with the maintenance of them. And so he's asking them to collect these every gold item. He's going to melt them and form a statue, and he's going to tell them to bow and worship to them, even though he knows the first two commandments. They all did. And all the people took off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them to Aaron. So the people do what he say. They have gathered their gold belongings, and they have given it to the high priest who requested them. He's going to make them their idol. And he took from their hand, and he formed an engraving tool, and made a molded calf. And they said, this is your mighty one, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. So he made the calf. Now, the calf may have showed some passive-aggressive resistance on his behalf. After all, he would not want to make a full-size bull, but the bull would have been worshipped by the Egyptians who had enslaved them. Their bull god was one of fertility and etc. So that's one of the things they were kind of looking for at this juncture in their life. They would have been familiar with the symbolisms and the connections in ways we are not, but Aaron's moderate measure of making a calf when he could have made a bull is indicative of perhaps some passive-aggressive resistance, but who really likes a passive-aggressive person? And so it's not sure who they say, it's probably the crowd. Not Aaron, that would have said he, because the he is in reference to Aaron, so named in the 3rd verse. Now moving on to the 5th. And Aaron saw and built an altar before it. And Aaron called out and said, tomorrow is a festival to Yahweh. So what's interesting here is they're dedicating their festival to Yahweh, but they are doing it through a form which he flat out forbids. He is the invisible creator of all that is invisible, and as such, he cannot be depicted in human or animalistic or anything else likeness. But for whatever reason, Aaron he's busy with the hands, if not the ministering. He's building them their altar. He's building them their calf, and that's what they're doing with their time, when they would have been better off twiddling their thumbs and just had some patience, because what was going on between Moses on the mountain and the man upstairs would be significant in their life. So why, what do you have to lose by waiting? Patience is a virtue. And they rose early on the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. So they're just going, they're having a jolly old time at Yahweh's expense, because it's an explicit violation of the commandments, which outline that he is to demand not only exclusivity of worship, but the right to dictate the means through which one can worship him. So the idols, there was to be no presence of anything physical in the Jewish sacred space for even the sheer suggestion of idolatry. So it was just kind of the invisible essence of the one who made the invisible, who could not be depicted in human or animalistic or physical likenesses. But more to the point of the passage, they are having a grand old time, and they, the wicked in his proud countenance, Psalm 10:4 says, does not seek God. God is in none of his thoughts, and that's what we witness here. These people are proud of the God they had created they had seemingly forgot the debt they owed Moses. As the one who had delivered him, he was the one through whom the miracles were wielded. He's the one without whom they would still be in bondage, and they could not wait for him. They had become selfish, and when we're selfish, we're more prone to pride, so they were proud of what they thought they had accomplished, but what it would really do them in the long run. And Yahweh said to Moses, "Go, get down, for your people whom you brought forth out of the land of Egypt have corrupted himself." So he had ended speaking in the 17th verse of the 31st chapter. This returns us to Moses, who is still on the mountain in company of Yahweh. Yahweh has commanded him everything that he needs, or needs to bring down, but here he's alerting him to the alarming emergency of what is going on in they are corrupting themselves by corrupting him in their worship. So that's what he's telling him. And Yahweh said to Moses, "Go, get down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves." How did they corrupt themselves? Well, we already know that, but we're going to elaborate more fully as we continue the verse-by-verse commentary. "They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I have commanded them, and they have made themselves a molded calf, and have bowed themselves to it, and slaughtered to it, and said, 'This is your mighty one, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt.'" So he's letting him know that the 10 Commandments that he had received on plates through his hand were being violated by it didn't take very long, and they couldn't even wait the 40-day period to not succumb to violating the expressly outlined commandment to not bow down to any images at all, even if they are in the name of Yahweh. That was the name of this molded calf at this point. They simply had no other name. And it didn't take long, and it didn't get far, because they almost earned their own execution, but Moses intervenes in prayer, which is one of the things we witness him do throughout his life. "And Yahweh said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and see, it is a stiff-necked people.'" So we described Pharaoh as a hard-hearted person. A stiff-necked is roughly the same thing, if not the equivalent to, then certainly the immoral equivalent of someone who's just stubborn and refuses to yield in spite of the obvious evidence. Now, there was no reason for them to be in a state of disbelief, that they had literally just been rescued by miraculous means. Do you think the same hand that had brought you out this far would bring you this far just to drop you on your head? No. So their faithlessness almost merits their own execution, and that's one of the things that Yahweh tells Moses he's going to do, or thinking about doing it. "And now let me alone, that my wrath might burn against them, and I consume them, and I make you a great nation." Now, the words "let me alone" are significant here, because what he's doing in those words is giving him an opportunity to resist what he says he's inclined to do. He's going to burn them up in his wrath, and he's going to make them toast, and he's going to this is also the test and temptation for Moses. He's going to promise the same thing through him that he had promised through Aaron, which Moses was passing on, but Moses knew the character and the nature of Yahweh, to whom he was intimately acquainted, so much so that he spoke to him as a man speaks to a friend, face to face and eye to eye. So he knew that if he violated his own promise delivered to Abraham, then his splendor would be diminished. Not that it could be diminished. Whether he answered this question accurately or not, there's no reason to surmise that he would have gone through and just blotted out his promise to Abraham. But in any case, Moses does answer correctly, as we read in the next verse. "But Moses pleaded with Yahweh his Elohim, and said, 'Yahweh, why does your wrath burn against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a strong hand?' Now, what's interesting here is that in other translations we read that Yahweh addresses Moses, telling him that the people whom you have led out of the nation, but that's not in this translation for whatever reason. But Moses, that the pronouns are significant because Moses reminds him that it's not mine, it's yours. I'm just doing what you tell me to do in order to bring the promise to come to pass. I am your willing servant. And Moses was a very meek man, we read in Numbers 12:3, and this ultimately is another scene which establishes superiority over Aaron, because Aaron is presumptuous that Yahweh had worked through him, and his sister Miriam are combined in conspiracy motivated by their jealousy. And what does Yahweh do? He tells them, he strikes Miriam with leprosy, thus the camp stops for 7 days. But that's neither here nor there. So he's asking, to what point, why would you bring them out this far just to drop them on their head? So that is the thought of Satan that is brewing in these people's minds right now, that they were abandoned, they were forsaken, all because they couldn't wait 40 days for his servant, who's their leader, and his servant, the servant is intervening, or an intercessory prayer to save the people who had rejected his leadership and Yahweh's kingship. Why should the Egyptians speak and say, for evil he brought them out to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from the heat of your wrath, and relent from this evil to your people. So the nation of Egypt and Israel would always be neighbors, and so if they no longer existed as a reminder to the Egyptians who had enslaved them, then what testimony would that be? What long enduring or internal principle could you communicate through a people who had perished en route to the promised destination, which they had called Pharaoh to let his people go? So he's telling him that, your honor and your prestige of your promise is kind of at stake here. Why don't you slow down and just forgive these people? I'll rebuke them in whatever way you say hand, but please, 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 just don't kill them. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, your servants, to whom you swore by yourself, and said to them, I increase your seed like the stars of the heavens, and all this land that I have spoken of I give to your seed, and they shall inherit it forever. So he's bringing it way back to the patriarchs of his people, his ancestors, some 500 years removed, 500 plus. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, these are the patriarchs of Israel. So before Israel was a nation, they were a family, and it's from Jacob's 12 children that the 12 tribes of Israel are formed. So but the promise was whether they looked above them, all this, the stars of the heaven, and also, it's not mentioned here, but it's mentioned elsewhere, the sand on the seashore. So whether they looked up or above or down, they would have a permanent reminder of a promise that is meant to last. And they shall inherit it forever. So that's going to be their lands once it's theirs. It won't always be their lands, as according to the covenant violation, but the Jewish people are a national entity and have been since 1948. And Yahweh relented from the evil which he said he would do to his people. So Moses prays effectively. He answers him in the right tact, perfect prudence, and right touch, and right words, and just the gentlest spirit. So he, I don't want to say that he caused Yahweh to repent, because Yahweh is in control of the outcome of any scenario from start to finish, but we do read that elsewhere that in Jeremiah 18:7 and 8, that any nation upon whom he pronounces woe, he reserves the right to bring back his promised destruction in the event of their repentance. And this is something we witness in Jonah, but this is, I feel, taking us a little far away from the Exodus, and that's all the time we have today to talk on it. We may or may not continue in the immediate future. Certainly, eventually, we'll finish this chapter, but that's not on our mind at this moment in time, but that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.